Hi everyone, welcome to today's TRI lecture of Eastern Ideologies Part 4. My name is Jonathan and I'll be your speaker today. So, you may have noticed that we have changed our series name from Chinese ideologies to Eastern ideologies. This is because since our last lecture on Buddhism, we have shifted onto an entire new course and new geographical region, which is India, so it would be pretty wrong to be calling these religions Chinese. Okay, so as you know by now, in all of our lectures, we try to cover one or two key Asian religions that we feel like are pretty important to share about, and in today's lecture, we'll be talking about Hinduism. Usually, we try to start our lectures by introducing one or two key figures about a certain religion. For example, with Confucianism, we had Confucius, and in Hinduism, it's one of the oldest religions to ever exist on Earth. So it's comprised of not people, but instead multiple cultures and traditions. And it's probably what makes Hinduism such an attractive religion, but it also makes it pretty much impossible to try and center the religion and its core ideals and its founding and its development on one single figure. Therefore, in order to try to introduce the founding and the developments of Hinduism, we have to start our story right here, which is the Indus River Valley. This was where the Indo-Aryan people once roamed and was established for around 3,300 to 1,300 BCE. And this was also the place where Hinduism was developed, which was believed to be around 2,500 BCE. So, the Indus River Valley civilization would stretch around what we know now today as from Afghanistan to India. Now, it was also an extremely advanced civilization in the sense that it had modern infrastructure such as brick houses, drainage systems, and water systems. Now, this modern infrastructure and scientific development was really important because it not only made sure that people don't have to worry about their living, for example, where they're gonna get their next meal or about their sanitation, but also it made sure that people were able to live modern lives with languages and writings, which was also a key figure or a key feature to spark an intellectual movement that would start a religion such as Buddhism. It was also through the arts, carvings, and architecture from the Indus River Valley civilization that people were first introduced to the concepts of Hinduism, for example, their gods or their myths. Now, this was also really important because these evidence was what made historians believe that the first traces of Hinduism comes from the tradition and the cultures of the people from the Indus River Valley civilization. Now, let's start by talking about the gods, or the three main figures, the gods that Hinduism believed in. This first four-headed bearded dude with really horribly matched hair and beard color is called Brahma. So Brahma was considered, or he was crowned, the creator of the universe, and he's often portrayed as a figure just sitting on a lotus flower, and he was believed to have the superpowers of just being able to create beings just by his mind. Despite being the creator, however, Brahma is also considered as one of the less important gods because his role kind of just stops after creating a universe. The days are probably cheering right now, but sorry, that's not where the story ends. And last of all, you're definitely asking, why does this dude have four heads? Isn't that kind of weird for a god? Well, you're probably right, but each one of his head represent one of the Vedas, which are the sacred texts of Hinduism. And now moving on, Mr. Genie here is also known as Vishnu, or also called the god of preservation. Vishnu is called the preserver. Okay, never mind. Vishnu is also called the preserver and the protector of humankind. His role is just to save Earth and pretty much save humankind. He's the typical superhero god that has all the powers that you really want. A pretty funny thing that links Hinduism to all of the rich literature that this religion has created is that people believed Vishnu saved human beings and saved humankind not through his god form, but instead he reincarnated as a human being and then saved Earth through that way. So for example, Rama from the Ramayana was a figure that was believed to be a reincarnation of Vishnu. Is probably considered the most important god because, let's face it, he's probably the only one out of the three important gods that can actually help humans or do anything, so please, Vishnu, 1k subs by the end of the summer, please.
No. Look at the top of his head.
Lastly, we have Shiva, who is also known as the Destroyer. So at this point, you're probably like, how can I remember all of these gods? The way I remember it is pretty funny, but I also remember these gods like a relay race. So first we have Brahma, who pretty much creates the universe and then decides to dip, handing the baton off to Vishnu, who sadly has to protect us human beings for around 2 million or so years. And then finally, like all good things, Vishnu has to hand the baton to my boy Shiva, who later has to pretty much destroy us all. So it's a pretty fun way to remember it, I guess. So it is commonly believed that Shiva will destroy the world by dancing a cosmic dance of death, which then humanity will pretty much just be destroyed the moment he starts dancing. I mean, it's a pretty interesting way to define the art, and it probably explains why Hinduism and places like India have such a big impact from the arts. But it's just an interesting perspective, I guess. Now, it is rumored, or it's believed by Hindu belief, that Shiva will destroy the world every 2,160,000,000 years. So, I'm pretty sure the world has existed for around 14 billion years, but I don't know, it doesn't really matter. I don't plan on being around for that long to see Shiva do the crazy dance and then kill us all. So, now that we've gone over the gods and have a few laughs, we now have to try and define, or I guess just describe the pillars of Hinduism. Now obviously this is one of the oldest and longest lasting religions humankind has ever seen, so it's going to be very hard to just define it in detail. We're just going to try and go over the broad concepts. So first off, Hinduism has the concept of the Atman, which is the eternal soul. The belief of this is that all beings, whether you're an animal, you're a human, all eventually are related to each other, and then we're all connected to the eternal being, which is Atman. The way you should try and think about this, which was what my history teacher taught me, is that think of it as a water bottle, and then you're shaking it, right? And then there's bubbles just floating up the bottle. Pretend the bottle's half filled. Now, each of those bubbles is like a being, and then when all those bubbles rise to the surface, they eventually join into the oxygen group, and that oxygen group, where everyone else eventually joins back in, is also known as the Atman. Now, the second concept is also known as the samsara, which is the continuous cycle of life, death, and reincarnation. The way to think about it is pretty simple, and I kind of had a lot of fun just thinking about this when I was young, but samsara describes life as a video game. It's like, if you're on level 1 and then you die, then you have to come back up in level 1, and then you have to keep trying until eventually you reach this sort of nirvana, or as our first concept would say, you would join back with the Atman, also known as the eternal soul. So, the last concept of Hinduism, and probably the most wide-known concept, is karma and the caste system. So karma, as everybody would define it, is that the consequences you face right now will later eventually come back to haunt you. So, for example, let's say I cheat on a test, which I obviously never do, and then that means that karma will come back and bite me, but for example, give me bad luck in my next test. And the caste system is also something that is obviously very controversial, and for me personally, I wouldn't say it's the most desirable system because it creates a very solid social hierarchy, but it's also something that's really bound and then tied together with Hinduism. So for example, the whole idea of Atman is that you have to keep working up your way through the social hierarchy until eventually you join back together with the eternal soul. Now, we have to move on to the quote section, and this was pretty interesting because when I was trying to read through the Vedas and then trying to find a few fun quotes, it was pretty interesting for me because the Vedas is not like any other text. It's written in a very, very short and concise form, the pretty much similar way that Confucius wrote his writings, or his disciples wrote down what Confucius said. But it's even more important that the Vedas tries to send out its messages in an extremely short form, but sometimes it doesn't really explain their idea fully, which is pretty interesting considering the fact that they probably just want people to make their own interpretations and then add some mysticism inside the religion itself. So, the first quote reads, "We desire what is not, but then try to bring it about that it is." Other than being a tongue twister, this was a quote that I just stared at my screen blank for 20 minutes trying to figure out what it means. At the end, I did come up with a meaning or my own interpretation of the quote, but I don't know if it adheres with the author's original intentions, but I doubt it if anybody can come up with the author's original intentions because there's just so less words to work with. So one of the first interpretations I came up with is a little bit more dreamy. I defined the quote as a human being and their human nature to try and just pretend we own, possess, or have things that we don't really own or is not really in reality. So for example, you have fantasy movies, you have these superpower movies. I feel like in some ways the Vedas is trying to emphasize on the naivety of human beings and the fantasies that we try to live through in our everyday lives. And then we can also just look at the second interpretation that I found, which was pretty realistic and probably the originally intentioned interpretation, but the second interpretation that I came up with was just a type of motivational quote, I guess, that human beings are always trying to bring what they desire into real life, so they're working really hard for it. And the second quote was really intriguing and probably one of my favorite quotes right now, but it says, "Desire links non-being to being." This made me think of one of my favorite books and my favorite authors of all time, which is The Importance of Living by Lin Yu Tang. And the reason why I was really intrigued by this quote and how I connected this to the book was that Lin Yu Tang in his book makes an argument that the beauty of human beings actually is purely in our nature, which is our desires and how we can satisfy our desires. So, for example, our desires would probably include me, for example, let's take that. Me, I would not probably be living my full human experience if I didn't eat my favorite curry rice, nor would I be living the full human experience if I didn't buy that 2K game and played it for 24 hours a day. Now, I know the Buddhists are probably raging right now, but if you really think about it, I think the Vedas is trying to convey a sense of meaning, saying that human beings also have to adhere to our nature sometimes to satisfy ourselves, to make sure that we live the full human experience. And now, last of all, this was probably the toughest part that I had to endure through when making the research for this lecture, which was, how does Hinduism connect with Western values? Now, it's pretty tough because we've pretty much covered most of the Western values that connect with Eastern culture, considering the fact that they're both big influencers on each other, but one of the biggest influences or connections that I saw from Hinduism and Western values is this idea that everything connects. So, like we said before, the Atman, everything eventually goes back to each other. The samsara, if you own somebody this amount of money this life, then next life you'll eventually have to repay them. Hinduism hinted at this idea that everything is connected. So this is the type of theory of everything that Western philosophers have been trying to chase for a long time. What is this ultimate thing that we all connect to that influences all of our beings? Marcus Aurelius would say this is nature, whereas classic idealists such as Socrates or Aristotle, they would try to argue that it's some other universal truth that binds us all together. Last of all, I hope everybody enjoyed this lecture. Thank you for attending today's lecture, and we hope to see you in future videos.